What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So despite people complaining about face decks all the time and the meta kind of getting a little bit stale now as we're on the brink of the next expansion, Hearthstone's definitely always been a game with a wide variety of viable decks that players can choose to play on the ladder at any given time. But when it comes to actually choosing which deck to play, it can be a little bit tricky. You know, a lot of times we'll see players craft a deck, play a few games with it on ladder, and then just decide that they don't like it and dust it all back and craft a different deck. So not only is this super resource inefficient, it's also a sign that a lot of you guys, myself included, can definitely have a tough time picking a deck in terms of what to play on the ladder. You know, especially now when there's so many websites, like you got Tempo Storm, you got Hearthstone, where you can just find a massive list of decks to choose from and craft. And this doesn't necessarily even just apply to crafting the cards in the first place. You know, there's tons of players that have completely full collections and still have a really difficult time deciding what deck to play on the ladder. So today we thought we'd talk a little bit about some tips and tricks and some things that might help you guys find which deck to play on the ladder that's right for you. Specifically when it comes to like the ranked ladder is what we're going to be focusing on. If you're just kind of playing for fun, definitely you just want to play whatever makes you have the most fun. So as for the most important factors when it comes to choosing between things in terms of like net decks and stuff, well, definitely the first thing we need to mention is more just like the actual, viability of the deck itself. You know, before copying a deck you find somewhere, you want to make sure that the deck is both viable, meaning that you can have good results with it, and is built by someone who is, reasonably competent. It's not just like a random group of cards and stuff. And also that deck is going to have some relevance in the meta. You know, some Korean legend player might have gotten rank 1 with his list, but that list was built for the Korean meta, which is definitely different to the North American meta. So if you try and net deck that guy's specific deck, try to play it on North America, there's a chance that you might end up just losing a whole lot. Now, this doesn't matter necessarily if you're looking at something like the Tempo Storm meta snapshot or Hearthstone decks sorted by date and popularity, since you can usually get a pretty good idea of those things, but definitely be very careful of net decking from like specific like smaller tournaments and potentially like other servers that aren't English speaking, because a lot of those are built with those specific metas in mind, and the metas are a lot different than you might expect them to be. And if you're going to net deck, you might as well find the best and most successful decks in your meta, so we definitely do recommend finding something true and tested rather than something super risky. You know, this is a video about finding the right deck for you, not necessarily building the right deck for you. So yes, we definitely do recommend net decking to some extent, especially for the budget players out there who really have to choose how they spend their dust wisely. And picking a deck you know for a fact can be very helpful as well, because if you're not doing well on ladder, say with maybe Midrange Shaman or something, you know it's going to be because of your decision making rather than the deck being at fault. You know, that's a benefit that you get when you choose a deck that you find online. If you're playing some like super wacky Reno lock variant that you either built yourself or maybe a lot of people haven't really played or heard of, it can be a lot difficult to evaluate what your losses are coming from, whether it's on your own decisions versus the actual deck's power. Additionally, a lot of studies have shown that confidence can actually improve results in things like chess and poker and stuff like that, and being confident that the ladder deck you're playing isn't actually a pile of garbage is definitely helpful for sure. Either way, knowing that the deck you're copying is both viable and relevant is definitely very important, and probably should be one of the first things you should look at if you're looking to climb the ladder with a new deck that you're trying to find. So now let's take a look at some things that are definitely going to differ from person to person, which mostly comes down to your own personal play styles and your own personal decisions, really just what you want to play. And a lot of people are going to say that they prefer certain classes over others, but that's a little bit tricky since a lot of classes actually do have very different or similar play styles for different decks. You know, for example, you have Face Warrior versus Control Warrior, Zoo Lock versus Reno Lock. You can have completely different play styles based on the classes. Sure, there's some classes that also have like a very similar play style, but even something like Hunter can also definitely have enough variance to make the gameplay feel super different. And if you're on a budget, it can be a little bit tricky to play more than one class at the same time. So instead, it's maybe a little bit better to think about what kinds of archetypes or what kinds of play styles you enjoy playing, and then think about what classes or what specific decks potentially could suit that. You know, for example, if you want to play a really aggressive deck, a fast deck, a deck that doesn't maybe require that much decision making, you can look at the options available to you. In this case, you've got things like Face Hunter, Tempo Mage, Zoo, I guess, etc. And then you can think about whether you want to have tons of options and board interactions, in which case you probably want to play Zoo. If you want to just go all out face and really just try to rush out your opponent and not really play an interactive game, you could definitely go for Face Hunter. Or if you want to run with some spell synergies and with a little bit more randomness than some other decks, you could play Tempo Mage. In this way, you can kind of build a flow chart for yourself, starting at, you know, do I want to play which play style of deck do I want to play? Do I want to play aggro decks? Do I want to play mid-range decks? Do I want to play control decks, or do I want to play combo decks? And from those 4 categories, you can then branch out into the various options that you have for those play styles and those decks, and take a look at what is available based on the playstyle that you personally enjoy playing, because there's definitely a competitive deck or multiple competitive decks in each individual playstyle. Now, if you already know what your personal favorite playstyle is, it's not too difficult to kind of just look at all the decks that fit into that specific playstyle and then kind of weigh the pros and cons against one another and just look at each deck individually and go from there. But if you're a player who actually maybe you don't know what your playstyle is, or maybe you enjoy multiple playstyles, or maybe you just for whatever reason you can't decide which playstyle you want to play. So if you're a player who's undecided on what kind of playstyle they like or archetype they like, or maybe you actually just haven't played enough Hearthstone to figure it out, it can be definitely very tricky to decide. So we'll give you guys a brief explanation, and hopefully maybe you can get some tips and figure out which one you're going to enjoy the most. So aggro decks are actually really interesting to talk about. You know, they kind of get a little bit of a bad reputation, but contrary to popular belief, they actually do definitely take a lot of patience and a fairly kind of laid back sort of style to play. You know, when you're playing an aggro deck, there's going to be a ton of games where your opponent draws their early game and then their Reno Jackson or their armor, whatever they might have, and you just have absolutely no way to win the game no matter what you do. And there's also going to be a ton of games where you just get like an amazing draw and your opponent has no early game and you just straight up play your cards and win, and it's not even close even if you make a bunch of mistakes. So what we're getting at here is that aggro players don't necessarily have as much control over their win rates as, you know, control decks or slower decks might, for example, and therefore you kind of have to play like a ton of games to stabilize your win rate around its average range, and also be super patient throughout all the games you lose when there was nothing you could do. You know, aggressive decks definitely require a lot of planning, since you have to figure out what your optimal route to lethal is each turn, and they actually punish mistakes, your opponent's mistakes, a lot harder than other decks since they're just so fast paced. And at the same time, since a lot of games aren't necessarily that influenced by your decisions, your own mistakes are actually punished a lot less than other playstyles, I would say. Aggro decks also offer much shorter game times and are generally a lot less expensive to craft. This is probably the version that I would recommend to those budget players out there, just because aggro decks are the cheapest. You can build an extremely competitive deck for a lot cheaper on an aggro deck than you could on something else, and aggro decks also tend to stay around for a while. You know, they definitely stay around the meta, stay relevant in the meta throughout, you know, new expansions and nerfs and stuff like that, just because no matter what happens, there's always going to be a few things, a few advantages that aggro decks have that will never go away, and also advantages that will never be given to any other playstyle of decks. So skill and just kind of building up those aggro deck playstyles can definitely pay off in the long run as well. You know, for example, even if, you know, Zoo Warlock is like maybe 25 different cards in a year, Zoo Warlock is still relevant. It's still Zoo. People who are good at Zoo still hit Legend with it with no problems. You know, none of this is to say that aggro decks are inherently worse or better than any other archetype. You know, they're definitely all effective, but this is mostly just like the summary of what you can expect if you're looking to play aggro decks. So next up, let's take a look at mid-range decks. So mid-range decks are kind of like a little bit of a mix between aggro and control. They're kind of like slotted in the middle of the two, if that makes sense. Mid-range decks are generally like really good if you enjoy playing things like maybe playing Arena, or maybe you just want a deck that doesn't really lean heavily in any direction. Honestly, if you're someone who's completely undecided, mid-range is definitely a great place to start because it's kind of like the jack of all trades. You know, you got your solid value minions, you got your removal spells, you got that late game threat, and there's pretty much everything in your deck most of the time. This isn't to say though that mid-range decks aren't skill intensive, they definitely are, since you have to win on board. You don't really have any crazy combo kills or reliable early pressure. You know, pretty much every decision you make can definitely matter quite a lot, and mid-range is definitely one of the archetypes where it's very easy to tell the difference between a good player and a bad player. Still though, mid-range decks are a great choice if you really just want that solid, all-around, you know, balanced deck to learn the nuances of and have fairly even matchups across the board with pretty much everything. Next up, we've got control decks. Now, playing a control deck is pretty much the closest in Hearthstone that you could get to playing something that's a lot more methodical, maybe like chess or something like that. And you're definitely going to have to play control decks for a while before you get the hang of it. I don't know if we can necessarily say that control decks are easier or harder than other playstyles of decks to play, but one thing that's definitely certain is that when you're playing a control deck, when you personally make a mistake, you're going to get punished for it a lot harder than you otherwise would in other playstyles. Still, the nice thing about control decks like this though is that half the time you don't entirely need to plan a way to win. You kind of just need to be able to answer your opponent's threats and kind of just grind them out for resources, and you got tons of armor, you got your Elise, Jiraxis, or whatever, and your opponent's kind of just running out of cards. Control decks do tend to have an extremely long game time though, and it can kind of feel really bad losing a 45-minute game of Hearthstone, but at the same time it can feel really awesome winning a 45-minute game of Hearthstone too. And you're definitely going to feel like your decisions are directly what's affecting whether you win or lose a lot more, and that can definitely be an awesome feeling to have in the game if that's the kind of thing you're into. If you're looking to like really commit to a single deck super hardcore, you know, reap the benefits from that extra knowledge, that game sense, that practice, we definitely recommend playing a control deck. And last up, we've got combo decks. Now, combo decks are kind of like the opposite of playing control decks, actually. Instead of you kind of, you know, slowly grinding out your opponent into a win, and then them just kind of just running out of options, now instead you're racing to put your combo together before you lose. And they're often both the most satisfying and potentially the most frustrating decks to play, since when you get your combo and you win a game that no other deck could win, it just feels super awesome. But when you're one card off of it and you just get destroyed because you just didn't draw that last card, or maybe the RNG didn't go properly for you, it can feel pretty terrible. Combo decks often get randomly hosed by like certain cards or some very random matchup, so if you're going to play something like Anyfin Paladin or maybe a Malagos deck, you definitely really do need to learn the matchups and interactions that go along with each deck incredibly well if you want to be super successful with them. If you get really hyped by any kind of combo though, you're willing to play with maybe some suboptimal cards and kind of like struggle for survival every single game just for that chance to combo off at the end and just steal the game at the grasp of your opponent's hands, then the combo deck archetype's definitely going to be for you. Either way though, what are your favorite decks to play and why? Definitely let us know in the comments section below. Personally, I've been really enjoying playing Tempo Mage in this meta right now, and I'm definitely looking forward to how the meta is going to change in the new expansion. And either way, looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.